The wrong reached me before I could name it. I had laid the great table of Salomir 1,000 times, and 1,000 times the long sweep of white damask had looked back at me the same way, each cover squared to the next, each goblet a hand's breadth from the plate, each fold of linen sharp as a struck cord. But that evening, standing in the doorway of the Banquet Hall an hour before the doors opened, I felt the room lie to me. Something on that table did not belong, and the table knew it, even if I did not yet. I am Mr. Harrow, and for 31 years I had been steward of the household of the House of Salomir. A steward's whole craft is the noticing of small wrongness, a candle a degree out of true, a chair pulled a finger too far from the cloth, a servant's collar gone soft in the heat of the kitchens. I had trained my eyes to it the way a smith trains his ear to the ring of good iron. So when I stood in that doorway and felt the snag, I did not dismiss it. I walked the length of the hall slowly, the way I had walked it 10,000 times, and I looked. The Banquet Hall is the oldest room in the old palace, a vault of carved oak and dark gold where the house had feasted its allies and humbled its rivals for 4 centuries. That night it was set for the reconciliation banquet, a state dinner to seal a long, sour quarrel between our house and the neighboring house of Caradoc, whose lands pressed ours along the river and whose pride had pressed harder. 40 covers down each side of the table, and at the head 3 great chairs. The Dowager Countess of Salomir, our gray and unbending matriarch. The young Earl, her grandson, barely a year into his title. And between them the guest of honor, the Margrave of Caradoc, come at last to make peace. I counted the covers, 40 and 40. I checked the goblets, the salt cellars, the little silver dishes for the river fish that would open the meal, all correct, and still the snag would not let go of me. It was the candlelight that gave it up. The hall was lit by tall white tapers in branched candlesticks down the center of the table, and as a footman touched a long match to them one by one, the light slid along the silver and showed me what my counting had missed. There was a place setting that did not belong. Not a cover too many, the count was right, but the setting at the 3rd chair from the Margrave's left was wrong in every small particular at once. The spoon was laid with its bowl down. The knife crossed the fork. The goblet stood not to the right of the plate but squarely above it, like a stone set on a grave. And the napkin, every napkin in that hall was folded into the Salomir mitre, the household's own fold, taught to every footman the day he was hired. That one napkin was folded into a plain flat square, the way no servant of mine had folded a napkin in 31 years. I stood over it a long moment. A lesser man might have called it carelessness and put it right with 2 motions of his hands. I almost did. My fingers were already reaching when I stopped them, because carelessness is random and this was not random. Every error pointed the same way. Every piece of that setting had been turned, reversed, or moved by someone who knew exactly how it ought to lie and had chosen deliberately to lay it otherwise. It was not a mistake. It was a message. And I did not know who it was for. I straightened the setting with my own hands, folded the napkin into the proper mitre, turned the spoon, squared the goblet. Then I stood back and made myself remember it exactly as it had been, because I had a cold certainty I would need to. And as I turned to go and find out which footman had laid that side of the table, my eye caught the man standing at the far corner of the hall, at his post by the screen's passage, still as the oak around him. The new guard. And he was looking at the same place setting I was. His name was Vale. He had joined the household guard only that spring, posted to the Banquet Hall for state occasions. A tall, square-shouldered man with a still face and eyes that did not wander. The household guard of Salomir are not soldiers playing at ceremony. They are the real thing dressed in the old way, in the deep blue coats and the tall bearskins and the white gloves, and they hold the doors of the great rooms when the house receives. They are trained to see everything and show nothing. In 31 years I had learned that a good guard and a good steward are the same animal in different coats. Both of us paid to stand at the edge of a room and miss nothing in it. I crossed to him. One does not chatter with the guard during a banquet, but the doors were not yet open, and I had a question burning in me. "You saw it," I said quietly. He did not turn his head. His eyes stayed forward the way they are trained to. But he answered low under the sound of the footmen's footsteps. "The third setting from the Margrave's left. The spoon was inverted, the knife crossed, the cup stood over the plate." A pause. "It was laid wrong on purpose, Mr. Harrow." I felt the cold settle deeper, so I was not imagining it, and I was not the only one who had read it. "On purpose," I said. "Why would a man lay a single place setting wrong on purpose?" "To mark a seat," Vale said, "or to mark a man." And then he said the thing that turned the whole evening over in my hands. "That is the Margrave's own grandson's seat, the young Lord Edric, third from his grandfather's left. I checked the placement card an hour ago when they brought it in." I had not checked the cards myself. That was the work of the understeward, and the cold in me sharpened to a point. Someone had reached into my hall, found the precise seat of the one young man whose presence made this peace possible, and laid his cover like a thing already mourned, the goblet on the plate like a stone on a grave, the napkin folded flat, the way the dead are laid out. "Who laid that side of the table?" I said. "I do not know," said Vale, "but I will tell you who has been near it." His voice did not change, did not rise. "Twice since the linen went down, a man in the under-butler's black has crossed to that corner and stood at the third setting and done nothing that I could see and gone away again. He is not one of your regular men. I have watched this hall for 6 weeks and I know your regular men. This one I do not know." The doors would open in 50 minutes. I had 40 footmen, a kitchen at full boil, a dowager who would descend at the stroke of the hour and expect her hall flawless, and now, threaded through all of it, a wrongness aimed at the very seat the whole piece turned upon. A steward learns to carry many things at once and let none of them show on his face. But I will tell you plainly, my hands wanted to shake, and I did not let them. "Describe the man," I said. "Older than your footman, lean, a scar through the left eyebrow. He carries his right hand half closed as if it pains him." Vale's eyes flicked, once the smallest motion, toward the screen's passage that ran behind the hall to the kitchens. "He went that way the last time, 8 minutes ago." I have spent my life learning when to act on my own judgment and when to carry a matter upward, and the line between them is the whole art of service. A steward who runs to his mistress with every shadow is a fool and soon a former steward. But a steward who hides a knife blade of a thing like this and lets it ripen into a scandal at the head of a state table, that is worse than a fool. I waited in the space of 3 breaths. The banquet could not be stopped. To cancel the reconciliation on the eve of peace on the strength of an inverted spoon would itself be the scandal, would itself wreck the very thing the wrongness was perhaps designed to wreck. No, the dinner must go forward. The wrong must be found and drawn out quietly before it reached the table, and without one guest ever knowing the hall had held its breath. "Stay at your post," I told Vale. "If the man in black comes near that setting again, you do not leave your post, but you mark him and you find a way to send for me. A glove dropped, a word to a passing footman, anything." I paused. "Can you do that without breaking your standing?" For the first time something moved in his face, not a smile, nothing so loose as a smile, but a kind of settling, the look of a man who has been given the thing he is for. "Mr. Harrow," he said, "I have stood at worse doors than this, watching for worse than a turned spoon. I will not break my standing, and I will not look away." I did not know then what those worse doors had been. I would learn before the night was out. For now I only nodded, the small grave nod 2 professionals give each other across a gulf of rank, and went to find my understeward and the man with the scarred brow, and to learn who, in the house of Salomere, wanted the young Lord Edric's seat to be a grave. My understeward was a careful young man named Pell, and I found him in the silver pantry counting the spoons against the inventory, which is the last thing done before a state dinner. He went pale when I described the man with the scarred brow. "That is Coram, Mr. Harrow," he said. "He came to us a fortnight ago with the Caradoc party, one of the Margrave's own household, sent ahead to see the arrangements before his lord arrived. He had a letter from the Margrave's chamberlain. I gave him the freedom of the service rooms. The chamberlain asked it as a courtesy." A courtesy. I have learned to be wary of the word. More harm has come into great houses dressed as a courtesy than ever came as a threat. "And he laid the table." "No, my own footman laid the table. But Coram asked to walk it after, to be sure the Caradoc covers were done in the Caradoc fashion, as a mark of respect to his lord. I saw no harm in it." Pell's hands had stopped on the spoons. "Was there harm in it?" "There may be," I said. "Say nothing to anyone. Go and find the placement cards and bring me the one for the third seat from the Margrave's left. Quietly." He went. I stood among the cold gleam of the silver and turned the thing over. A man of the Margrave's own household, sent ahead under a chamberlain's letter, with the freedom of the rooms, and that man had walked the table and marked the young Lord Edric's seat like a grave. The young Lord Edric was the Margrave's grandson. Why would a Caradoc man mark a Caradoc seat for sorrow? Unless the sorrow was meant to come, and someone wished it foretold. Or unless the setting was not a foretelling but a signal, a sign laid where the right eye would read it, telling some confederate which cover, which cup, which seat. The cup, the goblet had stood over the plate. I had squared it back with my own hand and not looked inside it. A goblet is filled at the table before the guests from the great ewers, but a goblet may also be readied beforehand. I felt the floor of the evening drop away beneath that thought. I did not run. A steward does not run. The sight of a running steward empties a room of its calm faster than fire. But I walked back into the Banneret Hall at a pace that, for me, was a run, and I went to the third setting from the Margrave's left, and I lifted that goblet to the candlelight and looked into the bowl of it. It was not empty. In the bottom of the cup, where the silver curved up from the stem, there was a faint dry residue, a thin pale crust, like the ghost of something that had been swirled in liquid and poured out, leaving only its memory behind. Our goblets are washed and polished to a mirror before every dinner. I had inspected the wash myself that afternoon. Nothing had been in that cup at 4 o'clock. Something had been in it since. I set the goblet down very gently, as a man sets down a thing he now knows is loaded, and I became aware of Vale's eyes on me from his post. I gave the smallest shake of my head, not yet hold, and he held. Across the hall near the screen's passage, the man Coram stood in the under-butler's black, a tray of folded napkins in his hands as though he were one of us, his scarred brow tilted as he watched a footman trim a candle. He was good. He looked in that black coat exactly like a man who belonged in my hall. Only the half-closed right hand, held a little away from the tray, told a different story. The hand of a man guarding it, or hiding what it had lately done. I had perhaps 40 minutes. The chain of it laid itself out in my mind with the cold clarity that comes to a man who has spent his life on the edges of rooms. Someone had readied the young Lord Edric's cup with something it should not hold. The setting was laid wrong not by accident, but as a sign, so that at the table in the press and dazzle of 40 covers and 400 candles, the right hand would know which goblet to fill, or which goblet to leave, or which goblet to pour from one cup to another. A scandal aimed at the heart of the piece. If the Margrave's grandson fell ill or worse, at the Salomere table, on the night of the reconciliation in our hall from our silver, there would be no peace. There would be war along the river within the month, and our house would wear the blame of it for 100 years. The wrongness was not aimed at a boy. It was aimed at the piece itself, and the boy was only the door it meant to come through. But who, a Caradoc man, had laid the sign? Yet a Caradoc man poisoning a Caradoc heir made no sense, unless he was not truly Caradoc's, unless someone had bought the chamberlain's letter, or forged it, and sent a hired hand into both houses' blind spot, the space between them, the no-man's land of a state dinner where each side trusts the other's people to be the other side's problem. There were men on both banks of that river who had grown rich on the quarrel and stood to lose everything by the peace. Grain factors who profiteered on the closed bridges, a border lord or two whose petty fiefdoms existed only because the great houses would not speak. Any of them might pay to keep the wound open, and the surest way to keep two proud houses at each other's throats was to make one of them murder the other's child at a peace feast. I could not prove a word of it in 40 minutes, but I did not need to prove it. I needed only to make it impossible to draw the loaded cup, the marked seat, and the scarred hand out of my hall before the doors opened, without one guest seeing, without the Margrave ever knowing how near his grandson had come to a grave, without the dowager's banquet showing a single crack. Quiet. It all had to be quiet. A loud rescue would do the saboteur's work for him. A hall thrown into uproar, a search, an accusation that was the scandal just arriving by another road. I crossed to the screen's passage as if to inspect the service of the wine, and I passed close by Coram, and I let my eyes meet his for half a breath. I am told my face shows nothing. But something in him read something in me, the way one professional reads another, and his half-closed hand closed the rest of the way, and the easy lean went out of his shoulders. He knew that I knew. And that was the moment the quiet evening became a contest, run silent, beneath the candlelight, with the doors about to open and the whole piece of the river on the table between us. I did the only thing a steward can do with a tainted vessel and no proof. I had it removed by ordinary means, so ordinary that nothing could be read in it. I summoned Pell with a flick of 2 fingers, and when he came I murmured, "The third goblet from the Margrave's left has a flaw in the rim. Replace it from the reserve and bring the flawed one to me in the pantry yourself, into your own hands, no footman." Pell, bless his careful soul, did not blink. He lifted the loaded goblet, set a clean one in its place, and bore the first away as though it were the most ordinary errand in the world. I watched Coram watch him do it. I watched the scarred brow draw down. The marked cup was gone from the marked seat, and the sign Coram had laid now pointed at nothing. It should have been enough. It was not, because a man who has prepared one cup has prepared for the cup to fail. I saw it in the way Coram set down his tray of napkins, unhurried, and drifted toward the service ewers, the great silver pitchers from which every goblet at the table would be filled before the toasts. If he could not poison one cup, he could poison the source and let the whole head of the table drink from it, and lay the blame on whichever house's man had handled the ewer last. The plan was not a single thread. It was a net, and I had cut one strand and the net still hung. I could not be in 2 places. The pantry held the proof, the ewers held the danger, and the doors would open in 20 minutes and the dowager would descend, and there would be no more moving in the open. I needed a second man, a man already in the hall, already trusted to stand near the head of the table, a man whose presence beside the Margrave would draw not one curious eye. I needed the guard. I crossed to Vale's post under the pretext of straightening the standard that hung above his head, and I spoke without looking at him, the way he had taught me without a word. "The cup is drawn, but he is moving on the ewers the wine. If the source is fouled, the whole head of the table drinks it. I must take the cup to a place it can be tested. I need the ewers watched, and I need them watched by a man who can stand where you stand and not be questioned." "Then leave them to me," Vale said. "You cannot leave your post to guard a pitcher, man." "I will not leave my post," he said. "My post is the head of this table. The ewers stand within 10 feet of it. From where I stand I can see every hand that touches them between now and the first toast." A pause, and then the thing that told me who he truly was. "I have guarded a head of state through a longer dinner than this, Mr. Harrow, in a country where the wine was the likeliest weapon in the room. I know the look of a man working a table. I know what to watch for in his hands. Take your cup. Trust the wine to me." I had wondered since the spring why a man of his bearing had come to stand the doors of a country house. I did not wonder now. Whatever Vale had been before he came to us, and a steward learns not to ask, he had been a man who kept other men alive in rooms exactly like this one, where the danger wore good clothes and a pleasant face, and the whole art was to stop it without a single guest setting down his fork. The household had hired a ceremonial guard. It had got, without knowing it, a man who had done this before, for higher stakes, and lived. "How will you stop a hand without breaking your standing?" I asked. It was the same question I had asked before, and this time I truly wanted the answer because everything turned on it. "A guard at a state table has one move no one questions," Vale said. "He steps one pace at the right instant into the right space, to dress the line, to take a dropped napkin, to present a guest's chair. A pace timed right puts my body between a hand and a pitcher, with no man able to say I did anything but my duty. I will not strike him. I will not seize him. I will simply be where he needs me not to be, again and again, until the moment passes and the danger is drunk down by no one." For the first time his eyes left the room and found mine, just for an instant. "Stillness is a weapon too, Mr. Harrow. I have used it more than my hands." I left him the ewers and the head of the table, and the life of a boy I had never spoken to, and I carried the loaded goblet to the pantry myself, because I would not put it in another's hands. In the pantry by the lamp I looked again into the cup, and Pell beside me looked too. The dry pale crust was real. I had not imagined it. But a crust is not proof, and I was no apothecary. I sent Pell running quietly for old Mistress Ferris, the still-room woman who had kept the household's physic garden and its medicine chest for 40 years, who knew every leaf that healed, and because the two studies are one study, every leaf that harmed. She came in her apron with flour on her hands, and she took the goblet to the lamp and tilted it and wet a fingertip and touched it to the crust and to the tip of her tongue, just the tip, and then she spat clean into the basin and rinsed her mouth before she spoke. "Hellebore," she said, "the black kind. Ground fine and dried in wine, and the wine poured off." Her old face had gone hard. "Mr. Harrow, that is not a thing that comes into a cup by accident. A few grains in wine and a strong man is on the floor inside the hour, sweating and seized and choking, and the physicians stand over him and call it a seizure or a bad oyster or the strain of the occasion, and by the time anyone thinks of poison the man is dead and the cup is washed." She set the goblet down. "Someone meant to kill at this table, and to have it look like nothing but ill fortune. There was the proof, and there was the chain hole, the marked seat, the loaded cup, the readied ewer, the hired hand in two houses' blind spot, a poison chosen because it counterfeits misfortune. If I had straightened that setting and walked away, if Vale had read the inverted spoon as carelessness and let it go, the young Lord Edric would have raised his cup at the reconciliation toast and been dead before midnight, and two houses would have gone to war over a death that no one could prove was murder, and the men who profited from the river's quarrel would have grown old and rich on it. The whole catastrophe had hung on whether two men at the edges of a room would trust a feeling that something did not belong. But proof in a pantry does not save a life in a hall. The doors were opening. I could hear far off the herald staff strike the floor 3 times, and the deep murmur of the guests coming up the great stair, and somewhere above, the slow descent of the Dowager Countess, who would take her place at the head of her table in 5 minutes and brook no interruption to the dignity of her house. I had the proof in my hand and no time to use it loudly, and back in the hall, alone with the ewers and the killer and the boy, stood one still man in a tall bearskin, holding a line I could not see. I gave Mistress Ferris one instruction: stay here, touch nothing, speak to no one, and I went back into my hall to take my place, because the steward of the house stands at the head of the room through a state dinner, and my absence would itself be a wrongness that the killer would read. I came in by the screen's passage as the guests were taking their seats, and I slid back into my place at the end of the high table as smoothly as if I had never left it, and I let my face be the face the house paid me to wear, serene, attentive, empty of everything I knew. The hall was full now, and golden, and loud with the careful courtesy of 2 old enemies pretending to be friends. The Margrave of Caradoc sat at the center of the high table, a broad gray lion of a man, watchful under his courtesy. To his right, the Dowager Countess, straight as a poker, her rings catching the candlelight when she lifted her hand. To his left, the young Earl of Salomere, our own boy lord, trying to look older than he was. And third from the Margrave's left, I made myself look once slowly, as a steward looks at his table, sat the young Lord Edric of Caradoc, the grandson, perhaps 19, with his grandfather's gray eyes and none of his wariness, laughing at something his neighbor had said, his fresh clean goblet standing innocent at his right hand where I had ordered it placed. He did not know he was the door death had chosen. He was the only easy soul at that table. Vale stood at his post behind and to the side of the head of the table, a tall blue and fur column, eyes forward, white gloves at his sides, and you would have sworn he was a fixture of the room, no more alive to its dangers than the carved oak lions on the mantel. Only I knew that every hand at that head of the table was being counted by him, weighed, watched, and that the great silver ewers, 3 of them, stood on the serving board within his sightline, 10 feet off, waiting to fill 40 cups. The fish came in and the first wine with it. The footmen moved down the table with the ewers, filling each goblet from the right. I watched Coram. He had stayed in the hall, of course. A saboteur does not leave before he sees his work done, and he had taken up the unremarkable station of a man overseeing the Caradoc guests' comfort, drifting along the back of the table with a folded cloth over his arm. No one questioned him. He was one of the Margrave's own. The Caradoc party were glad of a familiar face. He drifted, and he watched, and twice his half-closed right hand moved toward the serving board where the ewers stood, and twice, I swear it was nothing a single guest could have seen. The tall guard behind the head of the table shifted his weight and dressed his line and was, for just that moment, exactly between Coram's hand and the silver. A footman would step back and find the guard's shoulder where he meant to set down the ewer, and murmur a pardon and move along, and Coram's hand would close on nothing and withdraw. Once Vale bent, unhurried, to take up a napkin a guest had let fall, and the bending put him squarely across the gap to the third ewer for the length of a slow breath, and in that breath the hand that had been reaching drew back empty. It was the most extraordinary thing I have ever watched, and almost no one in that hall of 200 souls knew they were watching anything at all. A duel was being fought at the head of the reconciliation table, a duel of inches and instants, of a hand that sought an opening and a body that closed it, and the only weapons were a guard's trained stillness and his sense of exactly when to take one quiet step. He never touched the man. He never looked at him. He simply was not absent at any instant the danger needed him to be. But I could see what the guests could not, that Coram was growing certain. A saboteur balked once tries the cup, balked at the cup tries the source, balked at the source comes at last to the only thing left to him, the open, the desperate, the throw of a man who knows his quiet plot is dead and reaches for a loud one. I saw it gather in him. The fish was cleared. The meat came. The wine flowed, clean, harming no one, because the ewers had been guarded by a man no one knew was guarding them. And I saw Coram understand in the set of his ruined hand that the quiet way had failed, and that there was one path left that did not need a cup or a pitcher at all. The reconciliation toast was coming. At the sweet course, the Margrave would rise, and the Dowager would rise, and the young Earl would rise, and the whole hall would lift its cups to the peace of the river, and the young Lord Edric would rise with them, his fresh goblet in his hand. And in the press of 200 people standing, in the scrape of chairs, and the lifting of arms, and the great glad noise of a hall on its feet, a man with a folded cloth over his arm, and a small thing palmed in his ruined hand could pass close behind a laughing 19-year-old and do, in 1 second in the open, what he had failed to do in secret. A hand brushing a cup as its owner raised it, a pinch of black powder into wine already at the lips. No one would see it. Everyone would be looking at the Margrave. I understood at the same instant Vale did. I know he understood, because I saw the only sign he ever gave the whole night. His eyes, forward and dead level for 2 hours, moved once and found me down the table, and held for the length of a heartbeat, and I knew he was telling me, "It comes now at the toast in the open, and I cannot leave my post to stop it without becoming the scandal myself." For a guard to break from his standing and seize a guest of the Margrave's own household at the head of a state table, with no proof any guest could see, that would tear the peace as surely as the poison would. The killer had found the one move the guard could not answer with stillness. He had only to wait for the hall to stand. And then I understood my own part, and why the proof in the pantry was not a thing to be shouted but a thing to be shown, to one man, the right man, at the only instant it could not be denied. I rose from my place at the end of the high table. A steward may rise. It is his duty to oversee the toast. I came up behind the high table along the wall, unhurried, my hands folded, the perfect picture of a steward seeing to the readiness of the sweet wine. The Margrave was getting to his feet. The hall was beginning, in its hundreds, to rise. I did not go to the killer. I went to the Margrave. I stepped to his side as he rose. A steward attending the guest of honor at the moment of the toast is the most natural sight in any great hall, and I bent close, as if to ask whether his cup was filled to his liking, and under the roar of 200 chairs I said 6 words into the ear of the Lion of Caradoc. "My lord, your grandson, watch his cup." He was old, and he had not lived to be old by ignoring the man who poured his wine. He did not start. He did not turn his head. But the gray eyes moved, sharp as a blade drawn quiet, down the table to where his grandson was rising with the rest, fresh goblet in hand, and then to the man with the folded cloth who had drifted, in the great standing up of the hall, to a place close behind the boy's chair, Coram, his own man, his trusted forerunner, with his ruined right hand coming up out of the folds of the cloth. And the Margrave did the one thing that no scandal could be made of, because it was a grandfather's right and a guest's privilege and the most natural gesture in the world. He lifted his own cup high and called out in the great glad voice of a man making peace, "To my grandson, who will see the river open in his lifetime, Edric, come, stand by me for the toast." And he beckoned the boy up the table to his side, away from his chair, away from the folded cloth and the ruined hand, into the open space at the very head of the hall where 200 faces and 3 burning candelabra and 1 watchful guard could see every inch of him. The boy came, laughing, proud to be called, and the hall roared its approval at the warmth between the houses, and the trap closed on nothing. The young Lord Edric stood at his grandfather's shoulder, beaming, his fresh, clean cup in his hand, in the most public, most lit, most watched square foot of that entire hall. There was no quiet death to be had there. There was no shadow to reach into. The killer's last move had been answered by an old man's love made into a shield, and not one guest in 200 knew a thing had happened at all. But Coram, balked at the very end, made the mistake that desperate men make. With the boy gone from his chair, his folded cloth hung empty over an arm that had nothing left to do, and his ruined hand still held its small dark pinch. And for one instant, the instant a man feels his whole work die, he hesitated, frozen, exposed, the only still thing in a hall of motion except the guard. And the guard moved. Vale stepped. 1 pace, the pace he had told me of, the pace no one questions, but this time he did not step to fill a gap before a pitcher. He stepped behind Coram, smooth as a closing door, and his white-gloved hand came down not in a blow but in a clasp, firm as iron, over the ruined right hand and the small dark thing it held, folding both into a grip there was no breaking. To every guest who happened to glance that way, it looked like nothing like a tall guard steadying a servant who had stumbled in the crush of the standing hall, a courtesy, a moment's helping hand. Coram's face went white. He did not cry out, because to cry out was to be seen, and to be seen was to be finished, and even now the instinct of the trade held him silent. Vale bent his head and said something low into the man's ear that I did not hear and never asked to hear, and the two of them turned together, the guard's gloved hand still closed over the killer's, and walked calm, unhurried, a guard escorting a servant taken suddenly ill, out through the screen's passage and into the dark, while the reconciliation toast rang out behind them and 200 cups rose to the peace of the river. No one screamed. No one fell. No physician was called. The Dowager Countess never knew that her banquet had bent within an inch of catastrophe. She went to her bed that night believing it the finest state dinner of her long reign, and in a way she was right, for the finest service is the kind no one ever sees. The Margrave of Caradoc knew. He sought me out at the end of the evening in the emptying hall and took my hand in both of his, a thing a Margrave does not do to a steward, and said only, "You watched my table when my own watched it wrongly. Caradoc will not forget the house that kept my boy alive without telling him he was dying." And then he asked me one question, quietly. Who was the man in blue? I told him the truth, which was all I knew, that he was a guard of the household, 6 weeks in his post, who had read a turned spoon for what it was, and held a line no one could see for 2 hours without once breaking his standing. The Margrave looked down the long hall to where Vale had returned at last, to his post by the screen's passage, back straight, eyes forward, white gloves at his sides, as still and as unremarkable as he had been when the doors first opened, as though he had never moved at all. "A man who can do that," the Margrave said, "has done it before at higher tables than this." "I believe he has, my lord," I said. "He does not speak of it." "I have not asked." We gave Coram to the law that night, quietly, in a closed room, with Mistress Ferris's testimony and the goblet with its dry crust of black hellebore. And in the slow grinding of the quartz, it came out as such things do, that he was no man of Caradoc's at all, that the Chamberlain's letter had been bought, that he had been hired by a consortium of grain factors and a border lord who had grown fat on the closed bridges and stood to be ruined by the peace. They had meant to make one house murder the other's child and let the river run with 100 years of blood, and they had nearly done it, and the whole of their scheme had broken against the one thing they could not buy or forge or foresee. 2 men at the edges of a room who would not look away from a thing that did not belong. I am an old man now, and I have laid the great table of Salomere through 3 reigns of the house, and the peace of the river has held every year of it. Lord Edric is a grey lord himself now, with grandsons of his own, and he does not know to this day how near he came that night, and I have never told him, because the best thing I ever did in 31 years of service was a thing done so quietly that the man it saved slept soundly through it. But I will tell you what I learned, standing in that doorway at the start of it all, feeling a room lie to me. The world is kept safe far more often than anyone knows, and almost never loudly. It is kept by the ones trained to stand at the edges and notice, the steward who feels the wrongness in a turned spoon, the guard who reads a grave in a folded napkin and holds his post through the whole long dinner, taking one quiet step at a time, never striking, never speaking, simply refusing to be absent at the instant he is needed. The loud men get the toasts and the songs. But the peace was kept that night and every night since, by a still man in a blue coat who understood, better than any of us, that the truest strength a man can have is the strength to hold, and to be exactly where he is needed, and to do the right thing where no one will ever see it done.